Chapter 6. The link between the tax base, the wealth gap, and the American dream.
Economics, like medicine, is an imprecise art. In much the same way that doctors practice medicine, economists study the relationship between a society's resources and its production. Despite its sturdy foundation in mathematics, economics must account for all sorts of variables and wildcards, from the impact of laws, interest rates, and human behaviors, to the fallout from natural disasters, pandemics, and wars. The larger the scale of the economy, the more difficult the challenges become, and the more never-ending the work. There is a constant push and pull of forces that must be managed. This push and pull is evident throughout our history, and we can clearly see that when things become too unbalanced, the consequences can be dire. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the unusual confluence of statistical data, world events, and ineffective tax systems allowed major U.S. corporations in industries like big steel and oil to expand to a point where they suppressed the free market. To counteract this, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 with the goal of restricting monopolies and allowing a fair, free market to operate. This was exemplified by the many cases brought under the Antitrust Act against Standard Oil in 1911. Then history compounded the growth of these large corporations, so that by the end of World War I, the economy had started to roar, and by the 1920s, gluttony and abuses were everywhere. Those in power during the Roaring Twenties held a pervasive advantage, both politically and economically. The data shows that by 1929, the wealth gap in the U.S. had reached an all-time peak. That year, 10% of the population in America controlled over 82% of the country's wealth. Economic forces were far out of balance, and the middle and lower classes felt truly oppressed. In October of 1929, Black Monday and Black Tuesday hit. The stock market crashed, and the market experienced a downward slide for the next several years. By 1932, the market had lost 89% of its value. The country entered into the Great Depression, which would last for over 10 years. In fact, the stock market would not return to the highs of September 1929 until the year of 1954, almost 25 years later. Imagine if the market crashed to that effect today and did not return to its present level for 25 years. The hopes of an entire generation would be lost. Beyond the lost wealth, the effects of this economic meltdown were catastrophic. Unemployment and vagrancy rates skyrocketed. Families lost their homes and were torn apart. Starvation and poverty were rampant across the country, and cities were besieged by hardship encampments and high suicide rates. As the common cause of pulling together during World War II fueled the nation to come out of the Depression, Congress looked to balance the tax burden by instituting an expanded tax code that primarily derived its revenue from both personal income taxes and taxes on corporate profits. Everyone shouldered their fair share of the burden as the tax base was broadened to an equilibrium between individuals and companies. In 1943, the U.S. federal government saw its revenue balanced, with 40% coming from corporate taxes, 40% from individual income and payroll taxes, and the remaining 20% from excise and estate taxes. Most importantly, when taxes are derived from a larger pool of contributors, by definition and mathematically, the taxable base is more equitable. And, in part due to the tax structure put in place by 1943, the wealth gap began to close by the early 1950s, with the top 10% of the population owning less than 70% of the nation's wealth. Recognizing there would be a delay before changes to the U.S. tax code showed up in the data, the preliminary results of a narrowing wealth gap in 1943 clearly pointed to a trend that was moving in the right direction. As the wealth gap closes and the burden of government is shared, people's confidence in the American dream is renewed. The common cause of more equally advancing prosperity for all gained traction in the years after World War II. The GI Bill expanded and educated the workforce. The country's population exploded with the baby boom generation. And the system that combined income and corporate profit taxes appeared to be effective and equitable to some degree. From 1943 until 1978, the tax structure which shared the tax burden between individuals and corporations remained in place, relatively speaking. Correspondingly, from 1943 until 1978, the wealth gap continued to shrink, reaching its narrowest point in recorded history around 1985, when the top 10% of the population owned about 60% of the nation's wealth. A remarkable economic balance and stability had been achieved. But the one constant in history is that nothing remains constant. As things started to change again, the political climate moved attitudes away from the notion of shared sacrifice and prosperity toward a more aggressive approach to economic and tax policies. In other words, we were slowly walking away from the reasonable equity of the previous 35 years of the U.S. tax code. By 1980, the equality of the tax burden had already begun to evaporate, with individual income and payroll taxes generating 75.3% of the federal government's revenue, while only 15% came from taxes on corporate profits. This shift toward placing an unfair burden on middle and upper middle class salaries would only pick up steam from here. In 1981, newly elected President Ronald Reagan announced to the nation,
"We must go forward with a tax relief package. I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates for each of the next 3 years. Proposals will also be submitted for accelerated depreciation allowances for business to provide necessary capital so as to create jobs."
Under the premise of trickle-down economics, taxes on salaries, and to a greater degree taxes on companies, were reduced. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 centered on the principle that lowering taxes for the wealthy and corporations would increase the GDP, create more jobs, and theoretically result in more tax revenue for the government. Trickle-down economics was an experiment at best. There was no firm data to show that these changes would result in greater tax revenue for the federal government. It was a guess. There is an old joke that the difference between an economist and a witch doctor is a very thin line. Trickle-down economics did not work. Although there was a growth in GDP, tax revenue also fell as a percentage of GDP. The nation's debt grew rapidly from expanded government spending and the shifting of the tax burden. The new tax code for middle and upper middle class salaries and for corporations did not adequately increase government revenues. President Reagan would call America a shining city on a hill, saying,
"I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here."
The truth is that President Reagan's vision of a shining city on the hill, of equally fertile ground for everyone under the American dream, was probably well-intentioned. Reagan simply did not envision the rift of unintended consequences he would usher in. He didn't realize the extent to which powerful individuals with politically connected entities and corporations would lobby Congress for special interest tax exemptions. He did not recognize there would be a dramatic shift that unfairly burdened middle and upper middle classes, with income taxes to generate a vast majority of governmental revenues. Reagan did not foresee that corporations' influence on Congress would be so persuasive and pervasive that companies would be able to minimize their tax contribution to only 6% of all government revenues by 2019. Reagan did not know that tax revenue as a percentage of the GDP would not increase because the tax base would become small and limited, while tax loopholes would become large and numerous, and thus grow the national debt at unprecedented rates. In sum, Reagan did not have the prescience to see that trickle-down economics would turn out to be more than just wishful thinking. It would be a turning point in the economic history of the U.S., where we again began to slide back toward unsustainable economic inequalities and a fading American dream for millions of people. What started as trickle-down economics with Reagan's tax reforms continued through the Trump administration's Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. And so by 2019, corporate taxes accounted for only 6% of government revenues, while individual income and payroll taxes accounted for 86% of all government tax revenue. This data is all revealing, but the burning question, of course, is this: what does it mean to you? To answer that question, let us plug the data into a series of charts and let the visuals speak for themselves. One of the quintessential ways to measure the American dream is to ask yourself, will my children be better off than me? In other words, are economic trends working in the right direction for me, my family, and all those in my community? With that in mind, let us look at a simple chart of the American dream. This single dot-dashed line indicates the percentage of children who will earn more than their parents. The evaporating American dream. The declining percentage of Americans earning more than their parents by birth year. To see this graph of the evaporating American dream, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. As you can see clearly, fewer and fewer children from each generation are able to earn more than their parents, and currently there's no end in sight for the decline. It's hard to look at this data and not wonder why. Why are American families falling farther and farther behind? Could it be related in any way to the tax burden the nation has placed on middle and upper middle class families? Of course it could. Just look at this chart, which reveals the correlation between the rise in the tax burden and the decline in upward mobility between the generations. To see this graph of the evaporating American dream, with increasing taxes on salary income, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. Middle-class individuals born in 1940 had a 93% chance of acquiring more wealth than their parents. However, as the data now shows, individuals born after 1980 have only a 50% chance of out-earning their parents. A CNBC special report titled, "Why Americans Feel So Poor," illustrated this further.
As the middle-class lifestyle grows more expensive and uncertain, it's also moving farther beyond the reach of younger generations. In 2019, just 60% of millennials were part of middle-income households in their 20s, compared with almost 70% of baby boomers.
Once again, it is critical to point out that the reason the tax burden has skewed toward expanding taxes on workers' salaries is rooted in the corresponding tax breaks that politicians have showered on corporations since the 1980s. One glance at this chart reveals the mirror image. As corporate taxes have declined, the burden has dramatically shifted to working families in the U.S. and negatively impacted both their future prospects and the prospects of their children. To see this graph of the evaporating American dream, the correlation of increasing taxes on salaries and decreasing taxes on corporations, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. Here's the truly frightening part. In the current system, there is no end in sight to these trends that suppress wealth opportunities for middle-class and upper-middle-class people and families. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 continues to expand the wealth gap. This law will offer little or no tax relief to the middle and upper middle classes upon its full implementation in 2027, and in turn, it may give up to 83% of the benefits to the upper faction of the top 1% of the population. And remember, the top 1% already owns 40% of the nation's wealth. Let's hear that again. 1% of the U.S. population now owns 40% of the nation's wealth, and in turn, the top 10% of Americans, as measured by money and assets, now own over 80% of all wealth in the U.S. And their shares are only continuing to grow while everyone else's shrinks. The problem, of course, is not that individuals themselves are becoming fantastically wealthy. The problem is that they are in an unfair system that literally transfers wealth away from the middle and upper middle classes and sends it to the richest of the rich. Upward mobility is declining in inverse proportion to the widening wealth gap. If the American dream means that American children have opportunities to earn more wealth than their parents, then the American dream has been nearly strangled to death. Again, we can see this clearly in chart form. Correlation of the increasing wealth gap and declining American dream to increasing taxes on salaries and decreasing taxes on corporations. The wealth gap has not only reversed its course since the 1970s, but is now returning to the unhealthy and unsustainable levels reached just before the Great Depression. To see this graph of the correlation on the increasing wealth gap, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. Consider, if the top 10% of Americans own over 80% of all the wealth in the U.S., that leaves 90% of U.S. citizens scrapping amongst themselves in fierce competition for less than 20% of the nation's wealth. The further down the economic ladder a family is, the fewer resources they have to compete in this economy. Today, the middle-class family that lacks a professional accountant or a diverse portfolio of stocks, bonds, or real estate has almost no chance to compete with an upper-middle-class family that does. The U.S. might be the wealthiest nation on earth, but we have a remarkably uneven and inequitable way of organizing our economy and society. Taxes, in theory, should be structures that intend to treat everyone equally. The rich should pay their fair share, and so should the middle class and the poor. Then, the government should decide how to spend and support the underprivileged and create a society woven within the fabric of equal opportunity, where all can decide if they are willing to work hard in pursuit of the American dream. Instead, politicians have convinced the middle class and upper middle classes that the current tax structure, with 86% of the tax burden squatting on their salaries, is fair and equitable. The data clearly demonstrates this is not true. It is not fair and equitable. With high tax burdens and limited means to save for investments or properties, people in the younger generations cannot even buy a home, thus expanding the wealth gap and restricting upward mobility even further. Systematic change must come.